In the 5th year of the voyage, Cinnabar Levon noticed the first strands of dragon grass, coiling and writhing in the sea alongside the hull of the ship. He had no idea of what it was, of course, for no one on Majipur had ever seen dragon grass before. This distant reach of the great sea had never been explored. But he did know that this was the 5th year of the voyage, for every morning Cinnabar Levon had carefully noted the date and the ship's position in his log, so that the explorers would not lose their psychological bearings on this boundless and monotonous ocean. Thus he was certain that this day lay in the 20th year of the pontificate of Dizimal, Lord Arioch being coronal, and that this was the 5th year since the Spurifon had set out from the port of Tilomen on her journey around the world. He mistook the dragon grass for a mass of sea serpents at first. It seemed to move with an inner force, twisting, wriggling, contracting, relaxing. Against the calm dark water it gleamed with a shimmering richness of color, each strand iridescent, showing glints of emerald and indigo and vermilion. There was a small patch of it off the port side, and a somewhat broader streak of it staining the sea to starboard. Levon peered over the rail to the lower deck and saw a trio of shaggy, four-armed figures below. Skandar crewmen mending nets, or pretending to. They met his gaze with sour, sullen looks. Like many of the crew, they had long ago grown weary of the voyage. "You there," Levon yelled. "Put out the scoop. Take some samples of those serpents."
"Serpents, Captain? What serpents you mean?"
"There! There, can't you see?" The Skandars glanced at the water, and then, with a certain patronizing solemnity, up at Cinnabar Levon.
"You mean that grass in the water?"
Levon took a closer look. Grass. Already the ship was beyond the first patches, but there was more ahead, larger masses of it, and he squinted, trying to pick individual strands out of the tangled drifts. The stuff moved, as serpents might move. But yet Levon saw no heads, no eyes. Well, possibly grass, then. He gestured impatiently, and the Skandars, in no hurry, began to extend the jointed boom-mounted scoop with which biological specimens were collected. By the time Levon reached the lower deck, a dripping little mound of the grass was spread on the boards, and half a dozen staffers had gathered about it. First Mate Vormecht, Chief Navigator Galamoin, Jochil Nor and a couple of her scientists, and Migdal Haz, the chronicler. There was a sharp ammoniac smell in the air. The 3 Skandars stood back, ostentatiously holding their noses and muttering, but the others, pointing, laughing, poking at the grass, appeared more excited and animated than they had seemed for weeks. Levon knelt beside them. No doubt of it. The stuff was seaweed of some sort, each flat, fleshy strand about as long as a man, about as wide as a forearm, about as thick as a finger. It twitched and jerked convulsively, as though on strings, but its motions grew perceptibly slower from moment to moment as it dried, and the brilliant colors were fading quickly. "Scoop up some more," Jochil Nor told the Skandars, "and this time dump it in a tub of seawater to keep it alive." The Skandars did not move.
"The stench! Such a filthy stench!"
one of the hairy beings grunted. Jochil Nor walked toward them. The short, wiry woman looked like a child beside the gigantic creatures, and waved her hand brusquely. The Skandars, shrugging, lumbered to their task. Cinnabar Lavon said to her, "What do you make of it?"
"Algae. Some unknown species, but everything's unknown this far out at sea. The color changes are interesting. I don't know whether they're caused by pigment fluctuations, or simply result from optical tricks, the play of light over the shifting epidermal layers."
"And the movements? Algae don't have muscles."
"Plenty of plants are capable of motion. Minor oscillations of electrical current, causing variances in columns of fluid within the plant's structure. You know the sensitivos of northwestern Zimrol? You shout at them and they cringe. Seawater's an excellent conductor. These algae must pick up all sorts of electrical impulses. We'll study them carefully."
George Hill Noor smiled.
"I tell you, they come as a gift from the divine. Another week of empty sea and I'd have jumped overboard."
Lavon nodded. He had been feeling it too. That hideous, killing boredom. That frightful, choking feeling of having condemned himself to an endless journey to nowhere. Even he, who had given 7 years of his life to organizing this expedition, who was willing to spend all the rest of it carrying it to completion, even he, in this 5th year of the voyage, paralyzed by listlessness, numb with apathy. "Tonight," he said. "Give us a report, eh? Preliminary findings. Unique new species of seaweed." Joachil Noor signaled, and the Skandars hoisted the tub of seaweed to their broad backs and carried it off toward the laboratory. The 3 biologists followed.
"There'll be plenty of it for them to study," said Vormekht. The first mate pointed. "Look there. The sea ahead is thick with it."
"Too thick, perhaps?" Migdal Ha said. Cinnabar Lavon turned to the chronicler, a dry-voiced little man with pale eyes and one shoulder higher than the other. "What do you mean?"
"I mean fouled rotors, Captain. If the seaweed gets much thicker. There are tales from old Earth that I've read, of oceans where the weeds were impenetrable, where ships became hopelessly enmeshed, their crews living on crabs and fishes and eventually dying of thirst, and the vessels drifting on and on for hundreds of years with skeletons aboard."
Chief Navigator Galamoin snorted.
"Fantasy! Fable!"
"And if it happens to us?"
asked Migdal Haz.
Vormekht said,
"How likely is that?"
Lavon realized they were all looking at him. He stared at the sea. Yes, the weeds did appear thicker. Beyond the bow, they gathered in bunched clumps, and their rhythmic writhings made the flat and listless surface of the water seem to throb and swell. But broad channels lay between each clump. Was it possible that these weeds could engulf so capable a ship as the Spuriphon? There was a silence on the deck. It was almost comic. The dread menace of the seaweed, the tense officers divided and contentious, the captain required to make the decision that might mean life or death. The true menace, Lavon thought, is not seaweed, but boredom. For months, the journey had been so uneventful that the days had become voids that had to be filled with the most desperate entertainments. Each dawn, the swollen bronze-green sun of the tropics rose out of Zimrol. By noon, it blazed overhead out of a cloudless sky. In the afternoon, it plunged toward the inconceivably distant horizon, and the next day it was the same. There had been no rain for weeks, no changes of any kind in the weather. The great sea filled all the universe. They saw no land, not even a scrap of island this far out, no birds, no creatures of the water.
In such an existence, an unknown species of seaweed became a delicious novelty. A ferocious restlessness was consuming the spirits of the voyagers. These dedicated and committed explorers who once had shared Lavon's vision of an epic quest, and who now were grimly and miserably enduring the torment of knowing that they had thrown away their lives in a moment of romantic folly. No one had expected it to be like this, when they had set out to make the first crossing in history of the great sea that occupied nearly half of their giant planet. They had imagined daily adventure, new beasts of fantastic nature, unknown islands, heroic storms, a sky riven by lightning and daubed with clouds of 50 unfamiliar hues. But not this grinding sameness, this unvarying repetition of days. Lavon had already begun to calculate the risks of mutiny, for it might be 7 or 9 or 11 more years before they made landfall on the shores of far-off Alhanrol. And he doubted that there were many on board who had the heart to see it through to the end. There must be dozens who had begun to dream dreams of turning the ship around and heading back to Zimrol. There were times when he dreamed of it himself. Therefore, let us seek risks, he thought, and if need be, let us manufacture them out of fantasy. Therefore, let us brave the peril, real or imagined, of the seaweed. The possibility of danger will awaken us from our deadly lethargy. We can cope with seaweed, Lavon said. Let's move onward. Within an hour, he was beginning to have doubts. From his pacing place on the bridge, he stared warily at the ever-thickening seaweed. It was forming little islands now, 50 or 100 yards across, and the channels between were narrower. All the surface of the sea was in motion, quivering, trembling. Under the searing rays of an almost vertical sun, the seaweed grew richer in color, sliding in a manic way from tone to tone, as if pumped higher by the inrush of solar energy. He saw creatures moving about in the tight-packed strands. Enormous crab-like things, many-legged, spherical, with knobby green shells, and sinuous serpentine animals, something like squid, harvesting other life forms too small for Lavon to see. Vormigt said nervously, "Perhaps a change of course." "Perhaps," Lavon said. "I'll send a lookout up to tell us how far this mess extends." Changing course, even by a few degrees, held no appeal for him. His course was set. His mind was fixed. He feared that any deviation would shatter his increasingly frail resolve. And yet he was no monomaniac, pressing ahead without regard to risk. It was only that he saw how easy it would be for the people of the Spirifon to lose what was left of their dedication to the immense enterprise on which they had embarked. This was a golden age for Majipur, a time of heroic figures and mighty deeds. Explorers were going everywhere, into the desert barrens of Suvrail, and the forests and marshes of Zimrol, and the virgin outlands of Alhanrol, and into the archipelagos and island clusters that bordered the 3 continents. The population was expanding rapidly. Towns were turning into cities, and cities into improbably great metropolises. Non-human settlers were pouring in from the neighboring worlds to seek their fortunes. Everything was excitement, change, growth. And Cinnabar Lavon had chosen for himself the craziest feat of all, to cross the great sea by ship. No one had ever attempted that. From space, one could see that the giant planet was half water, that the continents, huge though they were were cramped together in a single hemisphere, and all the other face of the world was a blankness of ocean. And though it was some thousands of years since the human colonization of Madripoor had begun, there had been work aplenty to do on land, and the great sea had been left to itself, and to the armadas of sea dragons that untiringly crossed it from west to east in migrations lasting decades. But Levon was in love with Madripoor, and yearned to embrace it all. He had traversed it from Amblemorn at the foot of Castle Mount to Til Omen on the other shore of the great sea. And now, driven by the need to close the circle, he had poured all his resources and energies into outfitting this awesome vessel, as self-contained and self-sufficient as an island, aboard which he and a crew as crazy as himself intended to spend a decade or more exploring that unknown ocean. He knew, and probably they knew too, that they had sent themselves off on what might be an impossible task. But if they succeeded, and brought their argosy safely into harbor on Alhanrol's eastern coast, where no ocean-faring ship had ever landed, their names would live forever. "Hoy!" cried the lookout suddenly. "Dragons ho! Hoy! Hoy!"
Weeks of boredom, Vormik muttered, and then everything at once.
Levon saw the lookout, dark against the dazzling sky, pointing rigidly north-northwest. He shaded his eyes and followed the outstretched arm. Yes, great, humped shapes, gliding serenely toward them. Flukes high. Wings held close to their bodies or in a few cases magnificently outspread. "Dragons!" Galamoin called. "Dragons! Look!" shouted a dozen other voices at once. The Spiraphon had encountered 2 herds of sea dragons earlier in the voyage. 6 months out, among the islands that they had named the Styamont Archipelago, and then 2 years after that, in the part of the ocean that they had dubbed the Ariok Deep. Both times, the herds had been large ones. Hundreds of the huge creatures, with many pregnant cows, and they had stayed far away from the Spiraphon. But these appeared to be only the outliers of their herd. No more than 15 to 20 of them, a handful of giant males, and the others adolescents hardly 40 feet in length. The writhing seaweed now looked inconsequential as the dragons neared. Everyone seemed to be on deck at once, almost dancing with excitement. Levon gripped the rail tightly. He had wanted risk for the sake of diversion. Well, here was risk. An angry adult sea dragon could cripple a ship, even one so well defended as the Spiraphon, with a few mighty blows. Only rarely did they attack vessels that had not attacked them first, but it had been known to happen. Did these creatures imagine that the Spiraphon was a dragon-hunting ship? Each year, a new herd of sea dragons passed through the waters between Pillaplock and the Isle of Sleep, where hunting them was permitted, and fleets of dragon ships greatly thinned their numbers then. These big ones, at least, must be survivors of that gamut, and who knew what resentments they harbored. The Spiraphon's harpooners moved into readiness at a signal from Levon. But no attack came. The dragons seemed to regard the ship as a curiosity, nothing more. They had come here to feed. When they reached the first clumps of seaweed, they opened their immense mouths and began to gulp the stuff down by the bale, sucking in along with it the squid things and the crab things and all the rest. For several hours they grazed noisily amid the seaweed, and then, as if by common agreement, they slipped below the surface and within minutes were gone. A great ring of open sea now surrounded the Spiraphon. "They must have eaten tons of it," Levon murmured. "Tons. And now our way is clear," said Galamoin. Vormekt shook his head.
No. See, Captain? The dragon grass farther out. Thicker and thicker and thicker.
Levon stared into the distance. Wherever he looked, there was a thin, dark line along the horizon. Land, Galamoin suggested. Islands, atolls.
On every side of us?
Vormekt said scornfully.
No, Galamoin. We sailed into the middle of a continent of this dragon grass stuff. The opening that the dragons ate for us is just a delusion. We're trapped.
It's only seaweed, Galamoin said. If we have to, we'll cut our way through it. Levon eyed the horizon uneasily. He was beginning to share Vormekt's discomfort. A few hours ago, the dragon grass had amounted to mere isolated strands, then scattered patches and clumps. But now, although the ship was for the moment in clear water, it did indeed look as if an unbroken ring of the seaweed had come to enclose them fore and aft. And yet could it possibly become thick enough to block their passage? Twilight was descending. The warm, heavy air grew pink, then quickly gray. Darkness rushed down upon the voyagers out of the eastern sky. We'll send out boats in the morning and see what there is to see, Levon announced. That evening after dinner, Jochil Nor reported on the dragon grass. A giant alga, she said, with an intricate biochemistry, well worth detailed investigation. She spoke at length about its complex system of color nodes, its powerful contractile capacity. Everyone on board, even some who had been lost in fogs of hopeless depression for weeks, crowded around to peer at the specimens in the tub, to touch them, to speculate and comment. Cinnabar Levon rejoiced to see such liveliness aboard the Spiriphon once again after these weeks of doldrums. He dreamed that night that he was dancing on the water, performing a vigorous solo in some high-spirited ballet. The dragon grass was firm and resilient beneath his flashing feet. An hour before dawn, he was awakened by urgent knocking at his cabin door. A Skandar was there. Skeen, standing third watch.
Come quickly. The dragon grass, Captain.
The extent of the disaster was evident even by the faint pearly gleams of the new day. All night, the Spiriphon had been on the move, and the dragon grass had been on the move. And now the ship lay in the heart of a tight-woven fabric of seaweed that seemed to stretch to the ends of the universe. The landscape that presented itself as the first green streaks of morning tinted the sky was like something out of a dream. A single, unbroken carpet of a trillion knotted strands. Its surface pulsing, twitching, throbbing, trembling, and its colors shifting everywhere through a restless spectrum of deep assertive tones. Here and there in this infinitely entangled webwork, its inhabitants could be seen variously scuttling, creeping, slithering, crawling, clamoring, and scampering. From the densely entwined masses of seaweed rose an odor so piercing it seemed to go straight past the nostrils to the back of the skull. No clear water was in sight. The Spiriphon was becalmed, stalled, as motionless as if in the night she had sailed 1,000 miles overland into the heart of the Surveil Desert. Levon looked toward Vormekt. The first mate, so querulous and edgy all yesterday, now bore a calm look of vindication, and toward Chief Navigator Galamoin, whose boisterous confidence had given way to a tense and volatile frame of mind, obvious from his fixed, rigid stare and the grim clamping of his lips.
I've shut the engines down, Vormekt said. We were sucking in dragon grass by the barrel. The rotors were completely clogged almost at once.
Can they be cleared? Levon asked.
We're clearing them, said Vormekt. But the moment we start up again, We'll be eating seaweed through every intake.
Scowling, Levon looked to Galamoyne and said, "Have you been able to measure the area of the seaweed mass?"
"We can't see beyond it, Captain."
"And have you sounded its depth?"
"It's like a lawn. We can't push our plums through it."
Levon let his breath out slowly. "Get boats out right away. We need to survey what we're up against. Vormekht, send 2 divers down to find out how deep the seaweed goes, and whether there's some way we can screen our intakes against it. And ask Jochil Nor to come up here." The little biologist appeared promptly, looking weary but perversely cheerful. Before Levon could speak, she said, "I've been up all night studying the algae. They're metal fixers with a heavy concentration of rhenium and vanadium in their—" "Have you noticed that we're stopped?" She seemed indifferent to that. "So I see. We find ourselves living out an ancient fable, in which ships are caught by impenetrable weeds and become derelicts. We may be here a long while." "It will give us a chance to study this unique ecological province, Captain." "The rest of our lives, perhaps." "Do you think so?" asked Jochil Nor, startled at last. "I have no idea. But I want you to shift the aim of your studies for the time being. Find out what kills these weeds, aside from exposure to the air. We may have to wage biological warfare against them if we're ever going to get out of here. I want some chemical, some method, some scheme that'll clear them away from our rotors." "Trap a pair of sea dragons," Jochil Nor said at once, "and chain 1 to each side of the bow, and let them eat us free." Cinnabar Levon did not smile. "Think about it more seriously," he said, "and report to me later." He watched as 2 boats were lowered, each bearing a crew of 4. Levon hoped that the outboard motors would be able to keep clear of the dragon grass, but there was no chance of that. Almost immediately, the blades were snarled, and it became necessary for the boatmen to unship the oars and beat a slow, grueling course through the weeds, while pausing occasionally to drive off with clubs the fearless giant crustaceans that wandered over the face of the choked sea. In 15 minutes, the boats were no more than 100 yards from the ship. Meanwhile, a pair of divers, clad in breathing masks, had gone down. 1 Hjort, 1 human, hacking openings in the dragon grass alongside the ship and vanishing into the clotted depths. When they failed to return after half an hour, Levon said to the first mate, "Vormekht, how long can men stay underwater wearing those masks?" "About this long, Captain. Perhaps a little longer for a Hjort, but not much." "So I thought." "We can hardly send more divers after them, can we?" "Hardly," said Levon bleakly. "Do you imagine the submersible would be able to penetrate the weeds?" "Probably not." "I doubt it too, but we'll have to try it. Call for volunteers." The Spiriphon carried a small underwater vessel that it employed in its scientific research. It had not been used in months, and by the time it could be readied for a descent, more than an hour had passed. The fate of the 2 divers was certain, and Levon felt the awareness of their deaths settling about his spirit like a skin of cold metal. He had never known anyone to die except from extreme old age, and the strangeness of accidental mortality was a hard thing for him to comprehend, nearly as hard as the knowledge that he was responsible for what had happened. 3 volunteers climbed into the submersible, and it was winched overside. It rested a moment on the surface of the water, then its operators thrust out the retractable claws with which it was equipped, and like some fat, glossy crab, it began to dig its way under. It was a slow business, for the dragon grass clung close to it, reweaving its sundered web almost as fast as the claws could rip it apart. But gradually the little vessel slipped from sight. Galamoyne was shouting something over a bullhorn from another deck. Levon looked up and saw the 2 boats he had sent out, struggling through the weeds perhaps half a mile away. By now it was mid-morning, and in the glare it was hard to tell which way they were headed, but it seemed they were returning. Alone and silent, Levon waited on the bridge. No one dared approach him. He stared down at the floating carpet of dragon grass, heaving here and there with strange and terrible life forms, and thought of the 2 drowned men, and the others in the submersible, and the ones in the boats, and of those still safe aboard the Spiriphon, all enmeshed in the same grotesque plight. How easy it would have been to avoid this, he thought. And how easy to think such thoughts, and how futile. He held his post, motionless, well past noon, in the silence, and the haze, and the heat, and the stench. Then he went to his cabin. Later in the day, Vormekt came to him with the news that the crew of the submersible had found the divers hanging near the stilled rotors, shrouded in tight windings of dragon grass, as though the weeds had deliberately set upon and engulfed them. Levon was skeptical of that. They must merely have become tangled in it, he insisted, but without conviction. The submersible itself had had a hard time of it, and had nearly burned out its engines in the effort to sink 50 feet. The weeds, Vormekt said, formed a virtually solid layer for a dozen feet below the surface. What about the boats? Levon asked, and the first mate told him that they had returned safely, their crews exhausted by the work of rowing through the knotted weeds. In the entire morning they had managed to get no more than a mile from the ship, and they had seen no end to the dragon grass, not even an opening in its unbroken weave. One of the boatmen had been attacked by a crab creature on the way back, but had escaped with only minor cuts. During the day there was no change in the situation. No change seemed possible. The dragon grass had seized the Spiriphon, and there was no reason for it to release the ship, unless the voyagers compelled it to, which Levon did not at present see how to accomplish. He asked the chronicler, Migdal Haz, to go among the people of the Spiriphon and ascertain their mood.
Mainly calm, Haz reported. Some are troubled. Most find our predicament strangely refreshing. A challenge. A deviation from the monotony of recent months.
And you?
I have my fears, Captain, but I want to believe we will find a way out. And I respond to the beauty of this weird landscape with unexpected pleasure.
Beauty? Levon had not thought to see beauty in it. Darkly he stared at the miles of dragon grass, bronze red under the bloody sunset sky. A red mist was rising from the water, and in that thick vapor the creatures of the algae were moving about in great numbers, so that the enormous raft-like weed structures were constantly in tremor. Beauty? A sort of beauty indeed, Levon conceded. He felt as if the Spiriphon had become stranded in the midst of some huge painting, a vast scroll of soft fluid shapes depicting a dreamlike disorienting world without landmarks, on whose liquid surface there was unending change of pattern and color. So long as he could keep himself from regarding the dragon grass as the enemy and destroyer of all he had worked to achieve, he could, to some degree, admire the shifting glints and forms all about him. He lay awake much of the night, searching without success for a tactic to use against this vegetable adversary. Morning brought new colors in the weed, pale greens and streaky yellows under a discouraging sky burdened with thin clouds. 5 or 6 colossal sea dragons were visible a long way off, slowly eating a path for themselves through the water. How convenient it would be, Levon reflected, if the Spiriphon could do as much. He met with his officers. They too had noticed last night's mood of general tranquility, even fascination. But they detected tensions beginning to rise this morning.
They were already frustrated and homesick, said Vormecht, and now they see a new delay here of days, or even weeks.
Or months, or years, or forever, snapped Galamoin. What makes you think we'll ever get out?
The navigator's voice was ragged with strain, and cords stood out along the sides of his thick neck. Levon had long ago sensed an instability somewhere within Galamoin, but even so he was not prepared for the swiftness with which Galamoin had been undone by the onset of the dragon grass. Vormecht seemed amazed by it also. The first mate said in surprise, "You told us yourself the day before yesterday. It's only seaweed. We'll cut our way through it, remember?"
I didn't know then what we were up against, Galamoin growled.
Levon looked toward Jochil Nor. What about the possibility that this stuff is migratory? That the whole formation will sooner or later break up and let us go? The biologist shook her head. It could happen, but I see no reason to count on it. More likely this is a quasi-permanent ecosystem. Currents might carry it to other parts of the Great Sea, but in that case, they'd carry us right along with it.
You see,
Galamoin said glumly.
Hopeless.
Not yet, said Levon. Vormecht, what can we do about using the submersible to mount screens over the intakes?
Possibly.
Try it. Get the fabricators going on some sort of screens right away. Jochil Nor, what are your thoughts on a chemical counterattack against the seaweed? We're running tests, she said. I can't promise anything. No one could promise anything. They could only think and work and wait and hope. Designing screens for the intakes took a couple of days. Building them took 5 more. Meanwhile, Jochil Nor experimented with methods of killing the grass around the ship without apparent result. In those days, not only the Spirophon, but time itself seemed to stand still. Daily, Levon took his sightings and made his log entries. The ship was actually traveling a few miles a day, moving steadily south-southwest, but it was going nowhere in relation to the entire mass of algae. To provide a reference point, they marked the dragon grass around the ship with dyes, and there was no movement in the great yellow and scarlet stains as the days went by. And in this ocean, they could drift forever with the currents and not come within reach of land. Levon felt himself fraying. He had difficulty maintaining his usual upright posture. His shoulders now were beginning to curve. His head felt like a dead weight. He felt older. He felt old. Guilt was eroding him. On him was the responsibility for having failed to pull away from the dragon grass zone the moment the danger was apparent. Only a few hours would have made the difference, he told himself. But he had let himself be diverted by the spectacle of the sea dragons, and by his idiotic theory that a bit of peril would add spice to what had become a lethally bland voyage. For that he assailed himself mercilessly, and it was not far from there to blaming himself for having led these unwitting people into this entire absurd and futile journey. A voyage lasting 10 or 15 years from nowhere to nowhere? Why? Why? Yet he worked at maintaining morale among the others. The ration of wine, limited for the ship's cellars had to last out the voyage, was doubled. There were nightly entertainments. Levon ordered every research group to bring its oceanographic studies up to date, thinking that this was no moment for idleness on anyone's part. Papers that should have been written months or even years before, but which had been put aside in the long, slow progress of the cruise, now were to be completed at once. Work was the best medicine for boredom, frustration, and a new and growing factor: fear. When the first screens were ready, a volunteer crew went down in the submersible to attempt to weld them to the hull over the intakes. The job, a tricky one at best, was made more complicated by the need to do it entirely with the little vessel's extensor claws. After the loss of the 2 divers, Levon would not risk letting anyone enter the water except in the submersible. Under the direction of a skilled mechanic named Clays, the work proceeded day after day, but it was a thankless business. The heavy masses of dragon grass, nudging the hull with every swell of the sea, frequently ripped the fragile mountings loose, and the welders made little progress. On the 6th day of the work, Clays came to Levon with a sheaf of glossy photographs. They showed patterns of orange splotches against a dull gray background. "What is this?" Levon asked.
"Hull corrosion, sir. I noticed it yesterday and took a series of underwater shots this morning."
"Hull corrosion?" Levon forced a smile. "That's hardly possible. The hull's completely resistant. What you're showing me here must be barnacles or sponges of some sort, or—"
"No, sir. Perhaps it's not clear from the pictures," said Clays. "But you can tell very easily when you're down in the submersible. It's like little scars eaten into the metal. I'm quite sure of it, sir."
Levon dismissed the mechanic and sent for Noor. She studied the photographs a long while and said finally, "It's altogether likely." "That the dragon grass is eating into the hull?" "We've suspected the possibility of it for a few days. One of our first findings was a sharp pH gradient between this part of the ocean and the open sea. We're sitting in an acid bath, Captain, and I'm sure it's the algae that are secreting the acids. And we know that they're metal fixers whose tissues are loaded with heavy elements. Normally, they pull their metals from seawater, of course, but they must regard the spirophon as a gigantic banquet table. I wouldn't be surprised to find that the reason the dragon grass became so thick so suddenly in our vicinity is that the algae have been flocking from miles around to get in on the feast. If that's the case, then it's foolish to expect the algae jam to break up of its own accord." "Indeed." Levon blinked. "And if we remain locked in it long enough, the dragon grass will eat holes right through us?" The biologist laughed and said, "That might take hundreds of years. Starvation's a more immediate problem." "How so?" "How long can we last eating nothing but what's currently in storage on board?" "A few months, I suppose. You know we depend on what we catch as we go along." "Are you saying—" "Yes, Captain. Everything in the ecosystem around us right now is probably poisonous to us. The algae absorb oceanic metals. The small crustaceans and fishes eat the algae. The bigger creatures eat the smaller ones. The concentration of metallic salts gets stronger and stronger as we go up the chain, and we won't thrive on a diet of rhenium and vanadium, and molybdenum and rhodium." "No, Captain." "Have you seen the latest medical reports? An epidemic of nausea, fever, some circulatory problems. How have you been feeling, Captain?" "And it's only the beginning. None of us yet has a serious build-up, but in another week, 2 weeks, 3... "May the Lady protect us," Levon gasped. "The Lady's blessings don't reach this far west," said Noor. She smiled coolly. "I recommend that we discontinued all fishing at once, and draw on our stores until we're out of this part of the sea, and that we finish the job of screening the rotors as fast as possible." "Agreed," said Levon. When she had left him, he stepped to the bridge and looked gloomily out over the congested, quivering water. The colors today were richer than ever. Heavy umbers, sepias, russets, indigos. The dragon grass was thriving. Levon imagined the fleshy strands slapping up against the hull, searing the gleaming metal with acid secretions, burning it away molecule by molecule, converting the ship to ion soup, and greedily drinking it. He shivered. He could no longer see beauty in the intricate textures of the seaweed. That dense and tightly interwoven mass of algae stretching toward the horizon now meant only stink and decay to him, danger and death, the bubbling gases of rot and the secret teeth of destruction. Hour by hour the flanks of the great ship grew thinner, and here she still sat, immobilized, helpless, in the midst of the foe that consumed her. Levon tried to keep these new perils from becoming general knowledge. That was impossible, of course. There could be no secrets for long in a closed universe like the Spiraphon. His insistence on secrecy did at least serve to minimize open discussion of the problems, which could lead so swiftly to panic. Everyone knew, but everyone pretended that he alone realized how bad things were. Nevertheless, the pressure mounted. Tempers were short. Conversations were strained. Hands shook. Words were slurred. Things were dropped. Levon remained apart from the others as much as his duties would allow. He prayed for deliverance and sought guidance in dreams. But Jochil Nor seemed to be right. The voyagers were beyond the reach of the loving Lady of the Isle, whose counsel brought comfort to the suffering and wisdom to the troubled. The only new glimmer of hope came from the biologists. Jochil Nor suggested that it might be possible to disrupt the electrical systems of the dragon grass by conducting a current through the water. It sounded doubtful to Levon, but he authorized her to put some of the ship's technicians to work on it. And finally, the last of the intake screens was in place. It was late in the 3rd week of their captivity. "Start the rotors," Levon ordered. The ship throbbed with renewed life as the rotors began to move. On the bridge, the officers stood frozen. Levon, Vormecht, Galamoin, silent, still, barely breathing. Tiny wavelets formed along the bow. The Spiraphon was beginning to move. Slowly, stubbornly, the ship began to cut a path through the close-packed masses of writhing dragon grass. And shuddered, and bucked, and fought, and the throb of the rotors ceased. "The screens aren't holding!" Galamoin cried in anguish. "Find out what's happening," Levon told Vormecht. He turned to Galamoin, who was standing as though his feet had been nailed to the deck, trembling, sweating, muscles rippling weirdly about his lips and cheeks. Levon said gently, "It's probably only a minor hitch. Come, let's have some wine, and in a moment we'll be moving again." "No!" Galamoin bellowed. "I felt the screens rip loose. The dragon grass is eating them." More urgently, Levon said, "The screens will hold. By this time tomorrow we'll be far from here, and you'll have us on course again for Alhanrol." "We're lost!" Galamoin shouted, and broke away suddenly, arms flailing as he ran down the steps and out of sight. Levon hesitated. Vormecht returned, looking grim. The screens had indeed broken free. The rotors were fouled. The ship had halted again. Levon swayed. He felt infected by Galamoin's despair. His life's dream was ending in failure, an absurd catastrophe, a mocking farce. Jochil Nor appeared. "Captain, do you know that Galamoin's gone berserk? He's up on the observation deck, wailing and screaming and dancing and calling for a mutiny." "I'll go to him," said Levon. "I felt the rotor start, but then—" Levon nodded. Fouled again. The screens ripped loose. As he moved toward the catwalk, he heard Jochil Nor say something about her electrical project, that she was ready to make the first full-scale test, and he replied that she should begin at once, and report to him as soon as there were any encouraging results. But her words went quickly out of his mind. The problem of Galamoin occupied him entirely. The chief navigator had taken up a position on the high platform to starboard, where once he had made his observations and calculations of latitudes and longitudes. Now he capered like a deranged beast, strutting back and forth, flinging out his arms, shouting incoherently, singing raucous snatches of balladry, denouncing Levon as a fool who had deliberately led them into this trap. A dozen or so members of the crew were gathered below, listening, some jeering, some calling out their agreement, and others were arriving quickly, This was the sport of the moment, the day's divertissement. To Lavon's horror, he saw McDowell Hawes making his way out onto Galamoine's platform from the far side. Hawes was speaking in low tones, beckoning to the navigator, quietly urging him to come down. And several times, Galamoine broke off his harangue to look toward Hawes and growl a threat at him. But Hawes kept advancing. Now he was just a yard or two from Galamoine, still speaking, smiling, holding out his open hands as if to show that he carried no weapons.
"Get away!"
Galamoine roared.
"Keep back!"
Lavon, edging toward the platform himself, signaled to Hawes to keep out of reach. Too late. In a single frenzied moment, the infuriated Galamoine lunged at Hawes, scooped the little man up as if he were a doll, and hurled him over the railing into the sea. A cry of astonishment went up from the onlookers. Lavon rushed to the railing in time to see Hawes, limbs flailing, crash against the surface of the water. Instantly, there was convulsive activity in the dragon grass. Like maddened eels, the fleshy strands swarmed and twisted and wreathed. The sea seemed to boil for a moment, and then Hawes was lost to view. A terrifying dizziness swept through Lavon. He felt as though his heart filled his entire chest, crushing his lungs, and his brain was spinning in his skull. He had never seen violence before. He had never heard of an instance in his lifetime of the deliberate slaying of one human by another. That it should have happened on his ship, by one of his officers upon another, in the midst of this crisis, was intolerable, a mortal wound. He moved forward like one who walks while dreaming, and laid his hands on Galamoine's powerful, muscular shoulders, and with a strength he had never had before, he shoved the navigator over the rail, easily, unthinkingly. He heard a strangled wail, a splash. He looked down, amazed, appalled, and saw the sea boiling a second time as the dragon grass closed over Galamoine's thrashing body. Slowly, numbly, Lavon descended from the platform. He felt dazed and flushed. Something seemed broken within him. A ring of blurred figures surrounded him. Gradually he discerned eyes, mouths, the patterns of familiar faces. He started to say something, but no words would come, only sounds. He toppled and was caught and eased to the deck. Someone's arm was around his shoulders. Someone was giving him wine. "Look at his eyes," he heard a voice say. "He's gone into shock." Lavon began to shiver. Somehow, he was unaware of being lifted. He found himself in his cabin, with Vormekt bending over him and others standing behind. The first mate said quietly, "The ship is moving, Captain." "What? What?" "Hawes is dead. Galamoine killed Hawes and I killed Galamoine." It was the only possible thing to do. The man was insane. "I killed him, Vormekt." We couldn't have kept a madman locked up on board for the next 10 years. He was dangerous to us all. His life was forfeit. You had the power. You acted rightly. "We do not kill," Lavon said. "Our barbarian ancestors took each other's lives, on old Earth long ago. But we do not kill. I do not kill. We were beasts once, but that was in another era on a different planet. I killed him, Vormekt." "You are the captain. You had the right. He threatened the success of the voyage. Success." "Success?" "The ship is moving again, Captain." Lavon stared, but could barely see. "What are you saying?"
Come, look.
4 massive arms enfolded him, and Levon smelled the musky tang of Skandar fur. The giant crewman lifted him and carried him to the deck, and put him carefully down. Levon tottered, but Vormekt was at his side, and Jochil Nor. The first mate pointed toward the sea. A zone of open water bordered the Spiriphon along the entire length of her hull. Jochil Nor said, "We dropped cables into the water and gave the dragon grass a good jolt of current. It shorted out their contractile systems. The ones closest to us died instantly, and the rest began to pull back. There's a clear channel in front of us as far as we can see."
"The voyage is saved," said Vormekt. "We can go onward now, Captain."
"No," Levon said. He felt the haze and confusion lifting from his mind. "Who's navigator now?" "Have him turn the ship back toward Zimrol."
"But turn her around."
"Back to Zimrol." They were gaping at him, bewildered, stunned.
"Captain, you're not yourself yet. To give such an order in the very moment when all is well again, you need to rest, and in a few hours you'll feel
The voyage is ended, Vormekt. We're going back."
No.
"No? Is this a mutiny, then?" Their eyes were blank. Their faces were expressionless. Levon said, "Do you really want to continue? Aboard a doomed ship with a murderer for a captain? You were all sick of the voyage before any of this happened. Don't you think I knew that? You were hungry for home. You didn't dare say it, is all." "Well, now I feel as you do." Vormekt said,
"We've been at sea 5 years.
"We may be halfway across. It might take us no longer to reach the farther shore than to return." "Or it might take us forever," said Levon. "It does not matter. I have no heart for going forward."
"Tomorrow you may think differently, Captain."
"Tomorrow I will still have blood on my hands, Vormekt. I was not meant to bring this ship safely across the Great Sea. We bought our freedom at the cost of 4 lives. But the voyage was broken by it."
"Captain,
turn the ship around," said Levon. When they came to him the next day, pleading to be allowed to continue the voyage, arguing that eternal fame and immortality awaited them on the shores of Alhanrol, Levon calmly and quietly refused to discuss it with them. To continue now, he told them again, was impossible. So they looked at one another, those who had hated the voyage and yearned to be free of it, and who in the euphoric moment of victory over the dragon grass had changed their minds. And they changed their minds again, for without the driving force of Levon's will, there was no way of going on. They set their course to the east, and said no more about the crossing of the Great Sea. A year afterward, they were assailed by storms and severely thrown about. And in the following year, there was a bad encounter with sea dragons that severely damaged the ship's stern. But yet they continued. And of the 163 voyagers who had left Til Omen long before, more than 100 were still alive, Captain Levon among them, when the Spiriphon came limping back into her home port in the 11th year of the voyage.